All right, I think we're finally ready to start. Apologies for that. Um, I'm Matt Baum. I'm the Marvin Kell Professor of Global Communications here at the Kennedy School. And today is the second installment of the 2022-23 Misinformation Speaker Series, co-sponsored by Harvard and Northeastern University. Before I introduce today's speaker, just want to give you a quick reminder of the the final two speakers in the fall series. On November 16, we have Professor Stefan Lewandowski, and that will be here, same place, in person. And then on November 3rd, although we will also do it like this, hybrid. And then on November 30th, we have Jamie Druckman, who will be appearing virtually, so a Zoom conference. But today I'm really pleased to welcome Michelle Amazeen. She's Director of Communication Research and an Associate Professor in the Department of Mass Communication, Advertising, and Public Relations at Boston University. Her research examines mediated persuasion and misinformation, working at the intersection of journalism studies, media effects, and political communication. Her research explores the nature and persuasive effects of misinformation and efforts to correct misinformation. And today, she will be speaking to us on content confusion, navigating the media in an era of misinformation. So please welcome Michelle Amazeen.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm very pleased to be here. So today I am going to be sharing with you some of the research I've been doing over the years, which is making its way into a book with this working title. I want to start out by talking about a specific case study. So many misinformation researchers are examining misinformation within the context of social media. What I'm going to be talking to you about today has to do with how mainstream media is contributing to the disinformation problem. And this example here, some of you may recognize this person. This is David Rand over at MIT. This was an article that ran in Commonwealth Magazine, which is a Massachusetts-based magazine. And it is chronicling the efforts that about a campaign that ran in the Boston Globe that was profiling scientists, that was sponsored by Philip Morris International. And according to this article here, many of the scientists who agreed to participate in this didn't realize really what they were getting involved with, or didn't understand, or it was unclear to them. Some of them thought they were being profiled for an article in the Boston Globe, which was not the case. It was sponsored content or native advertising, which is what I'm going to tell you about today. After Commonwealth Magazine ran this article, the profile of David Rand disappeared from the campaign. So this is a related campaign that was put together by it ran in the Boston Globe. It ran in several mainstream media outlets, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Reuters. This is the example of it from the Boston Globe. You can see the masthead at the top, the Boston Globe. But if you look carefully, I know it's hard to see since you're so far away, but there is a disclosure that says this content is provided by Philip Morris International. If you scroll down, this looks just like a regular news article in the Boston Globe, only it's not news. It's paid content by Philip Morris International. So there were several articles in Commonwealth Magazine about this relationship between the Boston Globe and Philip Morris International. And the subhead in this article is, states, even very smart people aren't familiar with this ad concept. So this is why I'm sharing it with you today, so that you'll understand what this is all about. This was the campaign, the Philip Morris International campaign. This is another one that ran in the Boston Globe. This is the one that was thanking the scientists. So they profiled a number of different scientists. You can see their images in here. If you clicked on their images, it would give you a whole article about their science, thanking them for all the health advances they've made, the work on making society a better place, et cetera. David Rand was one of these people. And there was other people. There's some BU researchers, Boston University researchers as well. So this is what the campaign looked like. So let me define for you what native advertising is. It is a type of covert marketing practice where an ad mimics or appears native to the platform on which it appears. I study it in mainstream news outlets. That's what I focus on. This content is supposed to be disclosed as commercial content. The issue is that there is not any standardization as to what those disclosures say. So sometimes it says sponsored content, promoted content, paid post, and that leads to confusion because there's no standardization. So a little bit of background as to how this practice began. So it does have an earlier type of a similar practice called advertorials, where it was in print news outlets. It was usually ran on the editorial page. It looked like an editorial, but it was paid for by the sponsor. So around the year 2000, you can see the apex in the newspaper industry of their ad revenues, receiving money from this paid content. This was mostly display and classified advertising. However, with the advent of the internet in the early 2000s, and then the introduction of Google and Facebook, and the rise of digital advertising, the revenue from newspapers went off a cliff, as you can see. At the same time, too, people began using ad blockers so that they didn't have to be interrupted with advertising. So this type of native advertising digitally was developed, presumably for consumers. It is less disruptive because you don't realize you're reading an ad. So specifically, the type of native ads that I look at are in news outlets. And today, many news outlets have created their own in-house brand studios. So in other words, the news outlets are creating this content themselves. No more are they hiring an ad agency. Is the client coming in with an ad agency and running the content? It is actually the New York Times that is creating this content. It's the Washington Post. It is the Wall Street Journal. It is the Boston Globe. They all have their in-house content studios. The New York Times content studio is called T-Brand Studio. So this is pretty widespread. Some current research that I'm working on looks at, we're trying to get a handle on how many mainstream news organizations have their own content studios. So this is according to the Press Gazette, which is a trade magazine, a trade publication. They listed out the top 50 English language US websites, news sites. And in going through them, over half of them, 26 of them, have an in-house content studio. That's the green part of the pie chart there. About a quarter of them don't have an in-house content studio. And then the rest of them, either they're news aggregators or they don't qualify for what I'm looking at. So there's a lot of these in-house content studios. I'm going to show you a few more examples of what this native advertising content looks like. So this is from the New York Times. If you scroll down, there's an article. If you look carefully at the top, there is a disclosure that says paid post by Cole Haan. So this is a lovely piece of content. It's not news, though. It is it's commercial content. The article is very nice. There's additional images in there. It's a very nice campaign. It's not just fashion brands that are engaging with news outlets to do this. As we saw, it's tobacco companies like Philip Morris International. But it's also the fossil fuel industry. So again, this is in the New York Times. If you scroll down, there's more content below that, more text and images that you can click on. But if you look closely again, you see the disclosure. This is paid for by Chevron. So people are seeing this content about global energy consumption. That seems to be an article in the New York Times, only it is paid content by Chevron. You can imagine that there may be some bias in the content because of its sponsored nature. So, as I said, there are disclosures. There are supposed to be disclosures on this content. The Federal Trade Commission has required for many years that commercial content needs to be clearly and conspicuously disclosed from news and entertainment content. So this is a law, section 503C, I think it is. So they have reiterated this. They reiterated this in 2015 to remind advertisers and publishers of this requirement. Nonetheless, my research has found most people do not understand these disclosures. Either they don't see the disclosures or they don't understand what they mean, because as I said, they're not standardized. So in my research, I found anywhere between 1 in 4 people to 1 in 10 people are able to distinguish this content. The rest of the people, the vast majority of the public, when they see this type of information, they think it's news content. They don't realize it's commercial content. It's not just my research, it's other scholars who are looking at this as well. And this is by design. This is not an accident. So this is a book by Mara Einstein. She's over at Queens College. She's a media scholar. It's called Black Ops Advertising. She gives example after example in this book of publishers making it more difficult for their readers to see these disclosures. They'll lighten the font, they'll make it smaller. So this isn't an accident, this is on purpose. I'm showing here an example from one of my experimental studies. So this is, we were looking at the disclosures. So this was a between subjects design. On the right, you can see the disclosure. It's visually prominent. There's a red box around it. It says partner content. On the left, it also says partner content, but it's much smaller and there's no red box around it. This is a nationally representative survey. And what we found, not really surprisingly, in the middle there, the prominence, the more prominent the disclosure, the more likely people are going to be to recognize, oh, this is commercial content. Similarly, we also manipulated what the disclosure language was, the explicitness of the language. The example I showed was partner content. That was the low explicitness condition. Very few people were able to recognize this. The medium level of explicitness was sponsored content. And then the highest level disclosure language explicitness was advertisement by name of sponsor. That lifted the level of people who were able to recognize that this was sponsored content. So I've also, beyond whether people can even recognize this content, I've also looked at, well, what are the effects of this content? So also a nationally representative survey, we're looking at how people perceive the publisher. The bars on the left have to do with their attitudes towards the publisher, and the bars on the right have to do with the perceived credibility of the publisher. The green bar represents people who recognized, oh, this isn't news, this is commercial content. The red bar represents people who were shown the same thing but didn't recognize that it was commercial content. They thought it was a news article. The orange bars represent people who were shown a display ad instead. And what we found is that when people recognize this content as commercial in nature, they have less favorable impressions of the publisher, both their attitudes towards the publisher, as well as it hurts their credibility as well. Different study, we also looked at whether there were differences in whether the publisher was a legacy publisher like the New York Times or the Washington Post versus a digital startup such as Vox. Same relationship when the dark blue bars represent people who recognize I'm looking at commercial content, not a seeming article. They had less favorable impressions of the publisher, but it was even worse if it was a digital startup publisher such as Vox. The legacy publishers were somewhat protected, I guess, by their legacy reputation. Nonetheless, they were also penalized for publishing this type of content. So coming back to the deceptiveness of these disclosures and people not being able to recognize it, I have a quote here from David Ogilvy. He was a famous ad man who founded the Ogilvy and Mather advertising agency. In his 1963 book, he said, "There is no need for advertisements to look like advertisements. If you make them look like editorial pages, you'll attract about 50% more readers. You might think the public would resent this trick, but there is no evidence to suggest that they do." Well, I have evidence that it does bother people. So again, a nationally representative survey, we asked people after we told them this is commercial content, not a news article, we asked them what they thought about this practice of native advertising. Most people said, I don't know. I don't know enough about this. I don't know what to think. So just either irrelevant or neutral comments. But there was a sizable amount of people, 1/3 of participants had unfavorable comments. So they mentioned that it seems untrustworthy for news outlets to be doing this, very misleading and bad for a trustworthy news organization. They thought it was deceptive, it's manipulative and dishonest. They also, unprompted, equated it with fake news. The data were collected in 2017, but many respondents connected it with fake news. Even respondents, there were 8% of participants who had somewhat favorable comments about it, but they were conditional. Many of those comments were conditional. This is fine as long as it's stated clearly, as long as it's disclosed. So it does seem to bother people. I was going to play a little video clip here. It doesn't seem to be loading right. I also tested whether it mattered whether the sponsored content was in a soft news format, like that Cole Haan example we saw, versus a hard news format, like the Chevron ad about global energy consumption. And what we found was that people were more aggravated. They had less favorable attitudes towards the hard news content. We also then showed them another news article that was not sponsored in any way. And the people who had been exposed to the hard news content had significantly lower attitudes, found the traditional journalism that was not sponsored, they found it less credible than the people who saw the soft news format. So this harms real journalism. Another thing to consider is that people are getting their news from different sources, different platforms now. It's digital, it tends to be digital, and more it's mobile. It's a small device where people are getting their news. So I also looked at whether that had any impact on people's ability to recognize native advertising. And sure enough, in an experimental study, where we randomly assigned whether people used a mobile device or a laptop to view content, even those that we primed to be motivated to look at the news content, it was significantly harder for them if they were accessing it on a mobile device than a laptop. So not really surprising, but this has implications as society moves towards mobile news consumption. So coming back to this initial example from Philip Morris, this is what it looked like. As I said, it was a campaign across different mainstream news outlets. So this is the one from the Washington Post. Their in-house content studio is called WP Creative Group. It's disclosed in the red box there. This campaign also ran in Reuters. If you scroll down, the article is down there. This one is labeled as well. It's actually labeled in two places: advertisement, paid content. Now, many times when clients are paying news outlets to create this campaign, this type of content, it shows up on the publisher's websites, but often they are also contractually obligated to amplify this content in social and other areas. And if I share this content, so the one on the left is the Washington Post, the one on the right is Reuters. I shared those articles on Twitter. The disclosures disappeared. So anyone looking at my news feed thinks, oh, Michelle is sharing Michelle is sharing an article from the Washington Post. It's not disclosed in any way that this is paid content. Same with Reuters. And we also know that many people don't click through articles they see on social media when they share it, before they share it. So therein lies a problem. This is what it's supposed to look like. The content also ran in the New York Times. I shared it, and it's very clear. It says advertisement is the first word in all caps, and it's also in the Twitter card. It says advertisement. So this is proper disclosure. This is required by the FTC, and it is frequently violated. So with my sometime collaborator, Chris Vargo from University of Boulder, Colorado, we looked at native advertising content on Twitter from 5 leading news outlets, and we found that half the time, over half the time, the disclosures disappear when this content is shared on Twitter. Other scholars have looked at other media platforms. It's similar on Facebook. So the content is hard to recognize by people. The disclosures disappear when shared on social media. I've also looked into how this affects, how native advertising content affects news agendas. So I wrote about this in the conversation. This image here is an example of a native ad campaign from Wells Fargo that ran in the Washington Post. The header is banking on clean tech. So Wells Fargo is talking about all the environmentally good investment things that they're doing. Since it's sponsored content, they don't mention that they also invested in the Dakota Access pipeline that was so controversial. So again, with Chris Vargo, we did a longitudinal study looking at all the native advertisements that ran in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal across a 5-year period between 2014 and 2019. So we looked at Fortune 500 companies that ran native advertising in those publications. We also looked at the news coverage of those Fortune 500 companies. We wound up with 24 or so companies, Fortune 500 companies that had enough native advertising and enough media coverage for us to do this analysis. And what we found is that half the time after a Fortune 500 company ran a native advertisement, there was significantly less news coverage of them in that outlet. So this is an agenda cutting effect that we found. Didn't happen all the time. I want to be clear about that, but it happened enough that it wasn't due to chance. There's something going on here. And we've heard the stories too, anecdotally, how publishers are cautious about what they write about large advertising clients. They don't want to lose that advertising revenue. So this is something to be paying attention to. So for example, if the New York Times is reporting about class action lawsuits against large companies that may have cancer-causing agents in their products, well, can you just run a native ad and cut the amount of reporting that's done on your company? I'm not saying that's what happened here with J&J, but the initial article and this sponsored content were published within weeks of each other. So problematic consumer products, opioid manufacturers are using native advertising content. So this was in the UK. It is sponsored content, an independent supplement by Media Planet, saying how opioids can help you manage your pain. And then, of course, the fossil fuel industry. So Oreskes and Conway have written about how the fossil fuel industry has used in the tobacco industry playbook of denying for so many years that climate change is real. Oreskes also looked at ExxonMobil specifically, looking across time at their internal communications, what their scientists were saying about the science, and what they were saying in their advertorials that ran in the New York Times up until 2014. And what they found was that there was a disconnect. Their advertorials were saying that, trying to cause people to question whether climate change is real, but their internal documents from their scientists were saying it's real and we're contributing to it. So that came out in 2017, this study here. In 2019, the Massachusetts Attorney General sued ExxonMobil for deceiving the public in Massachusetts about their contributions to climate change. And an exhibit in their lawsuit was this native advertisement created by T-Brand Studio in the New York Times. So this is concerning. What is ExxonMobil saying in their native advertisements? Does it contradict what the New York Times newsroom is saying? So I've laid out a number of concerns about native advertising. It deceives audiences. The disclosures disappear half the time when you share them on social media. It harms journalistic integrity. People are find the content less credible after they've been exposed. They find the journalism less credible after being exposed to native advertising content. The native ads may contradict the real reporting of journalists. It cuts the agenda for future reporting half the time. And as media consumers, we have a finite amount of time. If we're being served native ads, we're not paying attention to the real news. And as I was prepping this deck, this is the other day, I was reading this article about Elon Musk buying Twitter and all that sort of thing. And I noticed, oh, look at what the New York Times, the editor's picks, these different articles. The editor is suggesting that I read this paid post about Boston's Children's Hospital. So the editor is serving me paid content rather than news content. Right there. So as a result of all this, I'm pleased to be joining a team of researchers at Boston University that are focusing in on climate change misinformation. One portion of our study is looking at native advertisements that ran from 2014 to present in the top 25 or so newsrooms, news outlets in the United States. And so we're gathering these environmentally related native advertisements that have been sponsored by fossil fuel companies. We're going to be looking at what are they saying? Is it accurate? Who's sponsoring these native advertisements? Does it contradict the reporting of the news outlets in which it appears? We're going to be also looking at the actual news reporting on these fossil fuel companies to see if we can replicate from that previous study. Is there an agenda cutting effect? So stay tuned for that. So I don't want to leave people totally depressed here. You know, we see all the statistics, the polls about how trust in media is at an all-time low. This is a Gallup poll, but we hear that from Pew and Reuters and all those different polls. There are things we can do. So we have some regulatory choices we can make, some structural things that we can do, and then educational. As far as regulatory issues, we can standardize the disclosures, or at least agree on a set of standardized disclosures that can be used. We can require that disclosures be digitally embedded in watermarks that stay with the content no matter where it goes on the internet, so that we'll see them in social media. There can be better enforcement of existing regulations. Right now, not much is done. I'm not aware of it. And the newsrooms need to, the news publishers need to be reassessing. Yes, we need this additional revenue because we're losing the print advertising of yesteryear. Is it worth risking that you are losing credibility from your readers by engaging in this practice? So I have a quick little tangent here. This effort, Tandem, was initiated. It was a effort by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It's their branded content studio, their in-house content studio. Some of you may be wondering, what are journalists saying about this? Well, the journalists at the CBC, they really pushed back against this. They wrote an open letter to Canadians from the CBC, and they said, why is Canada's public broadcaster disguising ads as news? So an open letter there. They pushed back, lots of news coverage of this. This is their public broadcaster. Hard to believe. As it turns out, the FTC equivalent in Canada renewed the CBC's publishing license and said that this tandem effort can continue, even though they recognize that there are some risks to it. So the journalists pushed back, did nothing in Canada. Other scholars who have talked to journalists about this say that most of them who had big problems with it quit, they leave the industry, or most of them have become resigned that this is just something we have to deal with. So structurally, we need to protect our public media, reducing commercial pressures on all media, but especially public media. We need to increase the subsidies given to public media. And we also need to think about different types of tax laws to support low profit and no profit news outlets, such as ProPublica. They don't have sponsored content in their news coverage. And then there's educational efforts as well. So being news media literate, being able to recognize where is this content actually coming from. So I've done some previous research looking at how knowledgeable, how media literate, how news media literate are people. And then we ranked them as either news novices or news experts. And we found that people who have more expertise in how news media operate, they're more likely to be able to recognize native advertising content. They're less likely to like it on social media, and they're also less likely to amplify it by sharing it. So media literacy, we need more of that. Illinois has passed a law where all public high school students need to have a public curriculum in media literacy. That's a start. And it's not just students that need to become more aware of this. It's scientists as well, so that they'll understand what they may be getting involved with if they are approached. Understand whether it's a news outlet that's going to be profiling you or whether you're going to be in sponsored content. So in conclusion, we need to do a better job of understanding the blurry environment in our media, understanding what the content is. We need to critically evaluate our media systems and protect our media so that we are being informed properly so that we can make accurate public policy decisions that aren't being influenced by commercial interests. And I will say, I'm happy to answer questions. If there is anybody who's hearing this, either in the room or listening, and you're a scientist and you've been approached in a similar fashion, I would love to hear your story. Please do reach out to me. So thank you so much, everybody, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
We'll go back and forth between the virtual audience and the audience here. So if there are questions here, I'll pass the mic around if anybody. Okay, well, this is easy because you're right next to me.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for Professor Amazeen. My name is Samuel. I'm here as visiting scholar. At the same time, I've been working as PR consultant in Japan. So I'd like to state a comment and a question. So my comment on, I think the same phenomenon like you explained today, what is happening in Japan. So everyone is really, it's very hard for everyone to distinguish the differences between the earned media or like a sponsored earned media or just a real media or the sponsored contest. So unfortunately, so there are so many the influencer newspaper companies publish their article in a native advertisement based mainly because of the financial reason due to the less recent revenue of the newspaper. They had to partly rely on the native advertisement and earn the revenue from the advertisers. And the bad thing is the newspapers is the most credential. I'm not credential. Is most credible, trustworthy media in Japan. So that's kind of so bad. So, and my question is around something related to the media desert program. So I think there is a problem of media desert issue in the local side of US. So is this kind of phenomenon happen as well? I'm not sure there are so many.
You're asking about the media deserts in the United States and elsewhere, whether this type of coverage is taking the place of real news content in
so
those areas? That's a good question. Yeah. I haven't seen that. What I've seen more happening in the news deserts is that partisan news outlets are popping up. So, there's some connection there. It's being sponsored, I guess, by political donors, political interests. But my experience is that it's not being, there's not the deception as far as this is a mainstream news organization that we're already familiar with. So no, I haven't seen that, but maybe that is where we're going. Good question.
Hello, thank you very much, Professor. I am Jenny. I'm a first-year MPP student at Kennedy School. I want to ask, I think you alluded to it as well, what is the current legislation on the digital advertising? Seems like there's a lack of standard, and also there's always evolving type of content on the internet. So how are the social media platforms regulating this themselves, and what are the legislations reinforced by FTC at the moment?
So the social media platforms are regulating this. It's not their in their purview to regulate this. It is the federal, and I guess perhaps state, but the Federal Trade Commission is the one who regulates interstate commerce to protect fair business practices as well as consumer interests. And their regulation in the FTC Act stated that commercial content needs to be clearly and conspicuously disclosed so that people can distinguish it from editorial content versus news and entertainment. And it's agnostic as to where the content appears. So that regulation applies whether it's in digital media, in social media, or elsewhere. They're not prescriptive. They've purposely said, the FTC has purposely said they don't want to be prescriptive about what the disclosures have to say, because as you pointed out, the media environment is constantly evolving. In Twitter, you only have a certain number of characters, so that's different than if you're on a blog, perhaps. So they've purposely been kind of lax in how they require the disclosure, but we're seeing that that's problematic. So I think they need to be more prescriptive.
Hello, Professor. Thank you. I'm Catherine. I'm also a first-year MPP, and I'm really worried about a scenario where you have a big business that develops many relationships with prominent news outlets. So my question is sort of, do you have a sense of how many relationships on average the average company has with news outlets?
That I don't. I will say from one of my prior studies, when we were looking at the Fortune 500 companies, we separated out clients, native advertisers who weren't in the Fortune 500. And what we found was that the most number of native ad engagements were from China daily. So the Chinese government is doing a lot of native advertising in American media.
One from the webinar. So they asked, how receptive are journalists and editors to your findings? Do we need to educate them as well as the public consumers of their products?
You know, that's a good question. How receptive? So, you know, I have given not this presentation, but similar presentations before, and I've been confronted by angry editors saying that they need the revenue. But then there's others who are thankful to learn about this. I think a lot of them see this happening. Maybe they don't know exactly how it happens. One of the unfortunate things is that content creators earn a lot more money creating this type of stuff than journalists do. So some journalists actually leave the newsroom and go over to the content studios to create the content because it pays better.
Hi, thank you so much. Yeah, this is fascinating. I'm Hugh, also MPP1, and I have some experience engaging in earned and paid media kind of at the same time, and some like weird interplays between those. I guess my question would be, if I had to choose one, like what kind of research design would you imagine like concocting for measuring effects of impacts on the information ecosystem around industries that are especially sort of drawn to using native advertising? And if you want to like scope it down to one, like you say, like, you know, climate change or fossil fuels, which is like a pretty, you know, hotly contested information.
Yeah, so that's what we're doing now. We are, it's a multi-phase study. We're first pulling all the native advertising that we can find from fossil fuel companies, energy companies, that sort of thing. And then we're going to be doing textual analyses of what they're saying in their ads, comparing it with what's being reported in the news outlets. We'll also be corroborating it with various fact-checking sites to see, you know, is it accurate what they're claiming in their native ads? And then we're also going to look at longer term what happens after a native advertisement runs. Is there Does it impact news coverage? If so, how? Is there more, less, favorable, unfavorable? And then there's another team who's also going to be looking at how this content is amplified in social media as well. So a lot we can do with it. We're open to recommendations, that sort of thing. We're still in the design phases and the collection phases. So happy to take on some recommendations.
We have another one from the webinar. So they wrote, the industry as a whole seems to be moving from subscriber income to paid advertising income. Are we near the tipping point where advertisers may exert more influence over content than readers?
I think we're there. Yeah, but at the same time, you do see, like I meant, this isn't a news outlet, but I mentioned Elon Musk buying Twitter. I mean, he's trying to do the opposite. He's trying to supplement. They get most of their revenue from advertisers. He's trying to protect themselves and gain some subscription revenue now is in his plans. So yeah, good question.
Thank you so much. It was incredibly interesting and also completely horrifying. Obviously, it's just such a scary problem. No, my question is, in your examples, you mentioned quite a few like global, there was a UK, Japan, Canada. Is anyone getting it right? Like who's doing the best in terms of this issue?
I do recall early on, maybe 5 years ago, I was looking at some of the disclosures from The Guardian, and they had several levels, which was kind of confusing. Like if they used one type of disclosure language, it meant that it was created in partnership with the news, with the news outlet. A different disclosure meant that it was created by the advertiser and then brought in. So they had like 3 levels. But the way they disclosed it, if you hovered your cursor over the disclosure, you could get more information. And some scholars have looked at if you're more transparent about your disclosure and why it's necessary, how it's helping the newsroom, people respond they respond more favorably to it. They're more accepting of it. So The Guardian was doing a better job of that, but I think that they may have modified it since then. So I think a lot of the publishers are tinkering and trying to get it right, be more transparent. Media consumers appreciate more transparency. I think that's a really good question. Yes, I do know that The Atlantic, so they were called out early on. So this is like 2014 or 2015. They had a native advertising campaign from the Church of Scientology, and it really, it blew up and it got a lot of negative publicity in the industry. And they since then created some sort of internal advisory board so that they could get it right, as they put it, something like that. But they do have been more cognizant over how it should be presented, not necessarily disclosed, but the types of advertisers that they want to work with. I don't know if there's any publishers who may refuse to work with the tobacco industry or the fossil fuel industry, but that's certainly worth exploring. It's a great question.
Do we have any other questions?
There is one more that just came in. So is there any law requiring newspapers to disclose conflicts of interest regarding sponsorship from advertisers related to their reporting?
I'm not aware of one. Wouldn't that be nice?
Anybody? Oh, okay.
Hi, sorry, just to follow up as well. What would you recommend for the prescriptions specifically that the FTC can kind of lay out for the media, especially considering right now, like you said, there are, from the US perspective, there are foreign companies, firms, states who are interested in the native advertising, and especially considering there is already a misinformation war in some ways on social media. So do you foresee the FTC lay out some kind of regulation against that type of political native advertising or something similar?
No, I don't see the FTC making any sort of proclamations on who can and cannot be an advertiser in our media. I can't imagine how that would work. I see them more as trying to make it more transparent to consumers and make sure that there's fair competition between the different media players.
I actually have a question. When you were showing some of those examples of legacy media outlets, well, Reuters and the New York Times, with the paid ads and the sort of microscopic disclosures, I was wondering why they wouldn't recognize the potential harm to the brand that this could cause. And then you showed us evidence that it does harm the brand. And I'm wondering, do they not know this? Have you talked to editors? You know, you think there's a cost in addition to the benefit, and I'm wondering if they're oblivious to the cost or if they've just assessed that the benefit outweighs it.
I think it's the latter. I think they assess that they're making probably millions of dollars from this. And they will say, Meredith Kopit, the editor of the New York Times, I mean, John Oliver has played a video clip of her talking to an audience in the industry saying that, you know, native advertising is good, people understand it, that it's beneficial, so they don't seem to think it's a problem.
Okay, well, we've hit 1 o'clock, so I think we're out of time, but thank you again for a fascinating talk, and as everyone else said, frightening. And join me in thanking Dr. Michelle Amazeen.